Thank you to my colleague from Florida. Today, the Education and the Workforce Committee held a hearing with the presidents of 3 universities, UCLA, Northwestern, and Rutgers. And at the hearing, I joined the Anti-Defamation League in calling for the resignation of at least one of them. But I want to provide some reflection on what transpired today and what has transpired at several hearings that we've now had. We've had the chance to hear testimony and question 7 university presidents now. In addition to those 3, also Columbia, Penn, Harvard, and MIT. 2 of those presidents from Penn and from Harvard have already resigned following the hearings. And what's striking about these hearings is just how difficult it is for these university presidents to answer in a straightforward way to the clearest questions of right and wrong. And it's striking the way that they have been unable to take the most common sense steps on their campuses to stop lawlessness and to curb this terrible rise in anti-Semitism. And when you look at the folks who testified today, or for that matter, any of the 7 presidents we've heard from, I don't think there's any of us who would suggest that these individuals are themselves anti-Semitic or prejudiced. And yet, they seem to believe that appeasing anti-Semites, appeasing anti-Semitic constituencies on their campuses, and thereby institutionalizing, normalizing, to use the word that the Anti-Defamation League does, anti-Semitism at their universities, they seem to believe that's what they have to do in order to keep their jobs. And so this is itself a fundamental failure of leadership and a reason to doubt the fitness of any of these particular individuals to lead major universities. But it also speaks to the overarching challenges we now face in American higher education, where they feel the need, these leaders of our top universities, to cater to the most bigoted and backwards forces at the expense of their own students' safety, well-being, and education. So I think it is vitally important that the Education and the Workforce Committee continues to shine a light on the horrible things that are unfolding at American universities, while at the same time trying to direct our higher education system in the direction of badly needed reforms that have, because we have seen how many long-standing problems have gotten us to this point. But to go into a little more detail about what transpired today, I asked each of the 3 university presidents, the president of Rutgers, the president of Northwestern, and the chancellor of UCLA, if physically blocking a student from entering their campus on the basis of the student's race, ethnicity, or religion is an expellable offense. And I was rather taken aback by the responses. Not one of them could give a simple yes. That is, by its very nature, an expellable offense. Instead, they said it depends upon the circumstances, the context, and so forth. I found that to be a rather shocking response. I think the correct response would have been, well, yes, of course. If the facts show that someone is physically blocking a student from entering campus, is using force to deny them access to our university that they're paying tuition to, and they're explicitly doing so in order to exclude people of that person's race, ethnicity, or religion, that is by its very nature something that would mean you should never be able to set foot on that campus again. Any individual who would engage in such conduct, yet not one of them could give that response. What's worse is this, of course, is not a hypothetical situation. It's something that we saw happen repeatedly at several campuses, and in particular at UCLA. So I played a video clip for the chancellor that showed exactly this happening. A Jewish student, it's a Star of David, who's trying to gain access to his campus to go to class, who has his student ID card in his hand, and a group of self-appointed enforcers lock arms and form a blockade to stop the student who tries to enter, who puts his hands in the air showing he means no harm, and they physically, by force, stop him from entering his own university. I asked the chancellor of UCLA, who are these people who formed this blockade? Are they students? He didn't know. I asked, have they been disciplined? He didn't know. It seems very clear that they got away with this absolutely monstrous conduct that should have no place in the United States of America. To make things even worse, a member of the committee, the representative from Minnesota, Congresswoman Omar, actually tried to minimize what had happened. In her questions, she suggested that this wasn't such a big deal because there are other pathways available to that student. So apparently it's okay to block people from moving about, their freedom of movement based upon their Jewish identity if there are other places that they're allowed to walk. Absolutely unbelievable. But UCLA's response to this situation was, of course, deeply problematic in a number of other ways. The situation there was allowed to build and build and build. The encampment got larger and larger and larger, and eventually things spiraled out of control, until eventually the chancellor did the right thing and called upon law enforcement to come and enforce the rules for those who refused to leave. But it never should have gotten to that point. Indeed, we now know that the police chief had advised the university not to allow an encampment, and yet UCLA allowed it anyway. Now, Chancellor Block claims that there is a system-wide UC policy that prevented them from moving more quickly. If this is so, the University of California needs to change its policy. If it's really true that the university will not seek the assistance of law enforcement until violence actually manifests itself, that is a deeply problematic policy on a number of levels. Number one, it allows for the violence to happen until you actually do anything to protect students. Number two, it allows for all manner of other illegal activity to continue unabated so long as those engaging in it characterize their actions as a protest. We saw all kinds of illegal activity in this anti-Semitic encampment at UCLA. We saw self-appointed students set up checkpoints, as I mentioned before, stopping Jewish students from being able to get to class. And the university did very little, it would seem, to stop this from happening. Indeed, the chancellor couldn't even tell me what happened to the students caught on video who were responsible. Now, this particular university leader, Chancellor Block, has served for 17 years and is retiring and will not be at that university very soon. So I would leave it to the judgment of the UC system to decide what the consequences for him in particular should be, with just a few months remaining in his tenure. But I will say there is now news just today that a new encampment has started at UCLA, and I would suggest that the chancellor needs to learn from what just happened and make sure that that is taken care of in short order. But generally, I don't think it's my role to be deciding which university leaders should stay and which should go. Ideally, that would be decided upon using the appropriate channels, and that when you have clearly fireable conduct, the Board of Regents, the governance boards would take appropriate action. But where I would draw the line on a broad level, on a general level, and say that anyone who crosses that line is unfit to lead a university is the line that was drawn by the Anti-Defamation League, as well as the Brandeis Institute and others. In the specific case of the president of Northwestern, who also testified today. Now, what was different about what happened at Northwestern from some other universities, and I believe Northwestern was the first prominent university to do this, is that the university president actually ended the encampment by giving the lawless members of that encampment what they wanted. He agreed to their demands. So I want to go through in detail, just to have it on the record, what those demands were. But first, I'll read you the statement from the Anti-Defamation League, as well as the Brandeis Center and Stand With Us. It says as follows: as the three leading organizations in the United States holding colleges and universities accountable for creating hostile environments for Jewish students, we are shocked and dismayed by the agreement Northwestern University President Michael Schill reached on behalf of Northwestern University with encampment protesters yesterday. For the last 7 months and longer, Jewish Northwestern students have been harassed and intimidated by blatant anti-Semitism on campus, worsening since October 7th. Yesterday, at the time this was written, President Schill signed an agreement with the perpetrators of that harassment and intimidation, rewarding them for their hate. For days, protesters openly mocked and violated Northwestern's code of conduct and policies by erecting an encampment in which they fanned the flames of anti-Semitism and wreaked havoc on the entire university community. Their goal was not to find peace, but to make Jewish students feel unsafe on campus. Rather than hold them accountable, as he pledged he would, President Schill gave them a seat at the table and normalized their hatred against Jewish students. It is clear from President Schill's actions that he is unfit to lead Northwestern and must resign. President Schill capitulated to hatred and bigotry and empowered and emboldened those who have used intimidation, harassment, and violence to achieve their ends. Instead of issuing fines and suspensions in accordance with university policies, he awarded protest groups with scholarships, professorships, and a renovated community home. Instead of permanently shutting down the encampment and making campus safe for all, he told protesters that they can stay until June 1st. Instead of reaffirming a long-standing university policy rejecting the anti-Semitic boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign, he created new pathways to its implementation. And instead of holding the perpetrators accountable, he committed Northwestern to actively defend, protect, and shield students from anyone else, such as potential future employers who may choose to hold the protesters accountable for their harassing and discriminatory conduct. The statement concludes, a prestigious institution that is supposed to be preparing our students for the future catastrophically failed to teach responsibility, respect for community values, and the fundamental principle that no one is above the law, regardless of how deeply or passionately they believe in their own cause. They reiterate, we call on President Schill to resign immediately and trust that if he fails to resign, the Board of Trustees will step in as the leaders of the university needs and remove him. Now, that statement was issued a couple weeks ago, of course, before the testimony that we heard today. And President Schill still has not resigned, and the Board of Regents still has not removed him. It can only be concluded that the Board of Regents is endorsing the institutionalization, the normalization of anti-Semitism that President Schill is responsible for by appeasing these demands. Now, there's the substance of the demands, which are deeply rooted in anti-Semitism, and then there's also the means by which they were achieved. Those means being force. And this is what I found particularly upsetting about the agreement reached by this president, President Schill of Northwestern, as well as President Holloway of Rutgers, is they congratulated themselves for it. They said that this was the way to negotiate a peaceful resolution. As a matter of fact, the exact words of the president were that this was a dialogue. They negotiated with their students through dialogue rather than force. Through dialogue rather than force, and engaging our students with dialogue rather than force. Every part of that statement is utterly preposterous. First of all, a lot of them weren't students. I believe he even admitted to that. Second of all, this was not dialogue. The president, for one thing, did not even consult with his own anti-Semitism committee to ask if they were okay with this agreement. And in fact, 6 members of that committee resigned after he reached the agreement with the encampment. When he was asked at the hearing today if he had consulted with Jewish students, he said that was impractical. What an utterly preposterous statement. He decides to change university policy in response to the demands of an anti-Semitic encampment, and he says it's impractical to even consult with Jewish students. Engaging our students with dialogue rather than force. It wasn't just students. It was not dialogue. It was one-sided. And the entire negotiation, as it was predicated on force. The only reason he talked to them at all is because they set up an illegal encampment that was used to terrorize students, and they refused to leave when they were ordered to. What precedent does that set? What incentive does that set for others who want to achieve their objectives, even if they're unobjectionable objectives? That the way to get what you want on this campus is to use force, is to defy the rules, defy the law, refuse to leave when you're told to try to be as disruptive as possible. What's worse is that after Northwestern University's president did this, we have seen this chain reaction where other universities are doing the same thing. One of which is Rutgers, whose president, President Holloway, was with us today. And he reached a similar agreement. He said something similar. He said, we engaged our students in a conversation that led to a peaceful resolution. Again, an utterly preposterous statement. The entire negotiation was predicated on force. It was not a conversation. It was a one-sided agreement with only those who are willing to resort to the use of force in order to get their way. I was glad to hear today, by the way, it was confirmed by President Holloway that he is no longer under consideration to be the next president of Yale University, of which I'm an alum. There are many of us who are deeply concerned about the message it would send if Yale, which has had many of its own problems when it comes to anti-Semitism on campus, accepted as its new president someone who was just responsible for institutionalizing anti-Semitism at his own university. But there have been others as well throughout the country, several of which are in my state of California. There has been one instance, at least, where there's been accountability. The president of Sonoma State, after reaching an agreement with the encampment there, with a number of deeply anti-Semitic provisions, like cutting off study abroad to Israel and even scrubbing university materials of any reference to Israel, and then even appointing the encampment as a permanent governing council to enforce that agreement, that university leader was placed on leave and has now resigned. That was the right thing for the leader of the California State University system to do. However, there are other campuses in California, in the CSU and UC systems, that have reached similar capitulation agreements with the lawless encampments on their campuses, who have followed this same script of rewarding the use of force, of institutionalizing and normalizing anti-Semitism, of setting a precedent that the way to get your way on their campuses is to break the rules, break the law, refuse to do what you're asked to do. And they all need to face discipline as well. There were a number of other remarkable statements at today's hearing with the three university presidents, though, of UCLA, of Rutgers, and of course, of Northwestern. In particular, from the president of Northwestern, who said, "I will not be commenting on the speech of our students or faculty or staff." A completely preposterous statement. This individual has commented on all manner of political issues. I was able to find a number of examples, just Googling this on my phone as he said it. And the idea that he wouldn't call out or fire or condemn a high-ranking university official who makes overtly racist statements, that absolutely defies belief. Incredibly, when asked by my colleague Burgess Owens if he would have dealt with a KKK demonstration in the same manner, he said he would not engage in a hypothetical, refusing to even condemn this most offensive of speech, or more than speech, of course, when we're dealing with the conduct that we've seen play out on these campuses. The president also said that, and the president I'm referring to is President Schill of Northwestern, that a police option on that campus was not possible. This is how he justifies just appeasing the demands of the encampment rather than enforcing the law. Well, I find that quite difficult to believe, that there couldn't have been a sufficient police response coordinating with local law enforcement to just ensure that those who were on the encampment left. But it's absolutely hypocritical when you look at the record of this president, President Schill, who actually reduced the police and defunded police when he was the president of the University of Oregon. So the committee, I know, is committed to continuing this investigation of anti-Semitism across American higher education. But it's also important to understand the need for broad reform in higher education based upon what we have learned. And there have been some encouraging signs lately. We saw, for example, MIT just recently said it's no longer going to require so-called diversity statements in the faculty hiring process. And even the Washington Post came out with an op-ed opposing the use of these diversity statements in hiring. I think our work is only just beginning. The hearings that we've seen so far have been deeply disturbing. It's highly important that we continue them and that we continue to keep an eye on every university that is failing to adequately address anti-Semitism in order to protect the students there, to protect their safety, and to protect their right to an education. But we also need to think about fundamental reform when it comes to academic freedom, when it comes to freedom of speech, when it comes to faculty hiring, and when it comes to so many of the other issues related to even the value of a higher education degree in America today. I truly believe this can be a turning point. America's universities have long been national assets that have helped us to become the greatest country in the world, the greatest economy in the world, the nation's leader in innovation on all fronts. And that is now in danger. So I look forward to continuing to work with the committee and colleagues on both sides of the aisle, because I want to say we had a number of colleagues across the aisle who asked very good questions and expressed appropriate concerns today as well, to work together to reclaim our universities as national assets rather than the liabilities that they've increasingly become.